We're so excited that you guys are here tonight, and we hope that you're blessed with the worship, the incredible worship here, and just a little bit of teaching from God's Word, and so that hopefully you can, as our name implies, encounter God tonight and know how to walk with Him. And so that's why we're here. That's why what we're all about as a ministry. And today we're entering a brand new series. As you guys can tell, we're going into the book of Hebrews, specifically chapter 11. And this commonly has been called the Hall of Faith. This is one of my favorite chapters in the entire Bible because it clearly portrays faith exactly for what it is. It gives the clearest definition of what faith is and how we can live by it. But it also does that by giving a lot of creative examples of people who we ought to emulate that kind of faith. And so that's why it's called the Hall of Faith. Kind of a play on words. I like it. But that term faith is thrown around a lot in Christian circles. And we have to understand what we're talking about here. Because a lot of people, first, understand that faith, literally the word means trust. It means to believe. It's like how we trust in a bridge to hold our weight over a giant chasm. We have faith that the bridge will hold us up. Or a parachute. When we pull the parachute, if we're falling down, we have faith that that is going to hold us and save us before we hit the ground. And as Christians, we believe that it is by faith alone that is the only thing that that we can do to reconcile us before a holy God, because it was actually Jesus that came down, God incarnate, came down and took our place on the cross and where we should have been. But it's his gift of grace that he gives to us as forgiveness of sins. He takes the wrath that we deserve, and then we trust in him by faith. We believe that his sacrifice was enough, and we trust that he really did rise from the dead, that he really did exist, and that he extends the hand, and we accept that gift by placing our faith in him. And that's clearly said over and over in Scripture. My favorite verse that shows that is Ephesians 2:8-9, where it says, "For by grace you are saved through faith, that it is not your own doing, but it is a free gift from God." You can't get more clear than that. It's a free gift of God so that we have no room to boast in front of God. It is by grace through our faith in God. And that is ultimately the best way that our lives could be spent. There's no other way that we would ever rather spend our lives. And so as Christians, when we first place our faith in Jesus, man, we know that that's the best way that our lives could ever be spent, is having our faith in Jesus. But if that's the case, once we believe in Jesus and once we have chosen to trust him with our entire life, because we understand that that is the best way our life could ever be spent, what do we do when life isn't panning out the way that we thought? When our life doesn't get better, but actually may get harder? Because it's easy to follow Jesus when life is easy, but when life gets messy and hard, that's when you really have to put faith on the scales and ask, am I going to keep pursuing faith and enduring, or is this faith thing not really going to work out the way I thought it is? This idea of faith, is it really what I expected it to be? And typically, when we ask that question, if we choose that it's not what we expected it to be, we typically go one of two different ways. Take that back. It's the world that we live in. We typically start to ask that question when we recognize the world to be extremely discouraging and distracting. The world is discouraging when we constantly are reminded of the brokenness and the sin that we live in, where because of our own sin, we recognize the distance between us and God, and we feel that. That's discouraging. The relationships that we have in our friends, our family, the pain and the strife that we can have in there, that's discouraging. Or whether you recognize that there's constant sickness in your family, there's pain in your body, there's death that accompanies you like constant companions, or maybe we're hurt by the sins of people that we dearly trust. That is being discouraged by this broken world. But the world is also extremely distracting. We are allured and enticed by the things that the world and what Satan ultimately want us to believe is more important than our faith. Our expectations from our friend groups to do certain things or to go certain places with them. The busyness of school and work may be clamoring for our attention instead of giving time to spending time with God. Or it's the allure of sin, where we start to look at sin and recognize that that's actually what we want a little bit more than rejecting sin and living for Christ. So the world is discouraging and it's distracting. And it's in these moments where we recognize these two different parts of the world where our faith feels weak, defeated, and sometimes worthless. And so the question that we need to wrestle with when we experience those two different things at its most is, what is my faith? What is faith? And what does a life of faith really look like in a discouraging and distracting world? Those are the questions that we are going to be wrestling with today and for the rest of this semester, actually, because we're going to be going through Hebrews 11 for the rest of this semester, and I'm really looking forward to it, but primarily because the author of Hebrews is writing to a group of people who are in the midst of this same thing that we go through all the time. If you've ever read the book of Hebrews before, you have to understand a few different things if you've never read the book of Hebrews. First is that the author is completely unknown. We have no idea who the author is. There's a lot of different theories out there. My personal theory is that it's Barnabas, but let me know your thoughts later on if you want. None of you know who that is. Well, no, I barely knew who that is anyway, but that's just the name I threw out there. So the author is unknown, but we do know who the audience was. It was primarily made up of Jewish Christians in the early church who were experiencing a lot of persecution and pressure from their communities. That was the discouraging and distracting world because they were constantly surrounded with constant discouragement from the persecution, people who were physically abusing them and socially abusing them to get them to turn away from their faith in Jesus. But they were also extremely distracted by false teachings about Jesus and what it meant to actually live by faith in their world. And so when they experienced these pressures, it caused them to be tempted to go into two different types of ditches. The first ditch is that they were tempted to abandon ship. Basically, they were tempted to, this faith thing didn't work out. I'm going back to what worked before. I'm abandoning ship and I'm going back to the Jewish tradition. They went back to the law. They went back to the religious system that made them feel comfortable in where they were at versus where they were at. So they were tempted to go abandon ship or to become absent. They didn't outright lose faith, but they decided not to show up to Christian gatherings like church or praying for the sick or just regular church meetings and gathering with the saints. That distracted them from pursuing a relationship with God. And the problem with both of these ditches is that both of them are missing the point of what it means to have faith in Jesus. Yes, faith is a change of mind. It starts in here, in the heart, and we change our mind about how we think about God. But it's not just that. It's a faith, it's a change of mind that does lead to action. Nothing that we can do can make ourselves right before God. It's ultimately our trust and our faith that saves us. But what reveals us having faith is ultimately if we're willing to show that in our actions, in how we pursue and endure in a discouraging and distracting world. And so all throughout the book of Hebrews, we're jumping in chapter 11, but what you need to understand all the way to the point where we're at right now, chapters 1 through 10, the author is going through all the different ways of how Jesus is superior to the ways that the Jews are tempted to go back to. Jesus is superior than the Jewish old tradition, the religious system that they were used to. Jesus is higher than that and better. The angels and even the heavenly beings that are true, where a lot of people were tempted to worship angels. That was some of the false teachings going on in the day. Jesus is superior to angels. Worship him alone. It's like Jesus is the driving instructor for his students, this is like the driving instructor for the people who he's writing to. He's helping them to know where they're heading to, where their destination is. How do you know where you're driving and where your destination is? You have to look where you're heading. If you look at the ditches and where you want to avoid, that's not a good way to drive. Sure, maybe you'll stay on the road for a little bit, but you're not going to be a good driver. It's just not going to work. That's not an encouragement for any of you to try. So what the author of Hebrews is doing is he's getting his audience to understand, look, this is the direction that you need to be going on. And ultimately, when our direction is set, our destination will be inevitable. Our direction leads to our destination. And so he's explaining how great Jesus is, who he is, what he's like, and then he gets to chapter 11, where he gives the clearest explanation of what faith is and what it means to live out that faith in a world of discouragement and distractions. He uses examples from the Old Testament, which we're about to get into, but first he gives, yet again, this clear explanation of what faith is, and you see it in the very first few verses. So I'm going to read them out again. Hebrews 11, 1 through 3 says, "Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made by things that are visible." Many people today, including well-meaning Christians, love to overcomplicate spiritual concepts, faith being a big one. Many people treat faith like it's a good attitude, that we need to basically have a good attitude or a good outlook on life. We walk by faith, not by sight. But some people also say that faith is just shooting in the dark when you don't have an answer. Science explains a lot of things, and faith is just, when you don't have an answer, just have faith. But other people, maybe even good-meaning Christians, will say faith isn't enough to make ourselves right before God, but we also have to have good deeds. We have to do things after all we can do. Faith is good, but it's only after all we can do. This is where we get the clearest definition of faith. So if you don't know what faith is, or if you've ever been unsure about what faith is, what it means to have faith and walk with God, look at what the author is saying here. He's saying that there's an assurance. It's a reality of things that we hope for. It's in the future. It's not right now, but we're hoping for it. The conviction or evidence of things that we do not see. Again, we can't see it. It's not something we can physically see, but there's evidence of it, and we are having faith that it is guaranteed. My simplified definition is this. Faith is trust in what is unseen and delayed rather than what is seen and immediate. It is trust and belief that what is unseen and delayed is guaranteed rather than what is seen and immediate and promises a lot but never satisfies. And that, ultimately, when we trust in what is unseen and delayed, that leads to a response. That shows when we are trusting in that leads to a response. When we start to live based off of this principle of faith, the discouragements and the distractions of the world won't take our eyes off of the road. It won't take our eyes off of the destination. And now is the part where I typically have some illustrations or examples to explain what that practically looks like, but the author of Hebrews kind of gives us examples right then and there. That's why this is all called the Hall of Faith. He's trying to give his Jewish Christian audience an illustration, so many illustrations, 5 weeks worth of a sermon series, that we're going to see, man, how did these people live out their faith? And also take encouragement in this is like, as we read through this list and see these great names, we're going to be tempted to think like, oh yeah, that's like the hero of the Old Testament. That's one of the greatest people of the Old Testament. But as he's listing off these people, he's not saying that these are the highest standard that you'll never reach, but he's giving these Jewish Christians examples so that they can look at their lives and say, no, I can do that. I can have faith like that person. We can do the exact same thing as these people. They weren't superheroes with superpowers that we don't have, but we can and are called to have the exact same faith that they had, which will drive us to live differently in our world, just like how it drove them to live differently in their world. And some of us grew up learning about these different characters in Sunday school. Connor learned about them in Jewish school, but a lot of people, many of us may not know exactly about these characters, so we're going to walk through them right now, and first starting all the way back at the very beginning with Abel. And so Hebrews 11, verse 4 says, by faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. All right, what the heck does that mean? That's a lot of words. So a lot of us, again, know the story of Cain and Abel. Abel and his brother Cain were the sons of Adam and Eve, and they were the very first set of brothers. And many people remember the story of Cain and Abel for the way that Cain killed his brother Abel. It was the very first murder and the sin of murder in the Bible. And honestly, that's a tough way to be remembered. If you're going to be in the Bible for anything, like just being killed by your older brother, that's a tough way to go out. But that's not how the author of Hebrews remembers him. He doesn't even mention Abel's death except for the very last part where he died, he still speaks. That means that he's in eternity. But look at how he talks about Abel and what he should be remembered for. Abel should have been remembered not by how he died, but by how he lived, which was offering a more acceptable sacrifice to God than his brother did, and that pleased God. So he offered a more acceptable sacrifice. What does that mean? Let's go back to the original part that the author of Hebrews is referencing. Genesis 4, verse 3 through 5. Genesis 4 says, in the course of time, Abraham brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. But for Cain, his offering had no regard. So Cain was very angry and his face fell. So again, what was so special about Abel's sacrifice, and how does it apply to our faith? When we look back at Abel, it's kind of interesting to see that he was a man of a few firsts. He was the first brother, right? Cain was born, and then Abel was born. That means that they were the first set of brothers. Abel was also the first man in heaven. He died, and then I just would have loved to see his reaction. Like he ends up in heaven. He's like, my brother hit me with a rock, and now I'm in this really cool place. Like, where is everyone? Like, no one's there. I just think that's funny. I don't know. I thought to include that. Whatever. Just like, what would I do? Oh, there's God. Anyway, Abel and Cain were also the very first humans to never walk with God physically. Remember, their parents, Adam and Eve, they were walking with God in the garden, but then sin entered the world, and then God cast them out, and now they were not with God. And so, as crazy as it sounds, Adam and Eve didn't walk by faith. They saw God. But Cain and Abel, they were the first ones that had to choose to live by faith. Faith is not in the things that you can see, but is there. And so they're growing up as the very first set of brothers, hearing from mom and dad about how they royally screwed up the world, but how God is there. God is real and he is holy. Do not sin against God. This is serious and the world is screwed up. And then Abel hears about this promise that God had given Adam and Eve. When God had spoken to, God was speaking to the serpent. We talked about it last week where Sam mentioned the proto-evangelion. It was the very first example of where the gospel, the good news of how God is reconciling the world back to himself, was featured in Genesis 3:15, where God says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between you and your offspring. And then speaking about Eve, her offspring will bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. That's referencing Jesus and the Messiah. I just think that is the coolest thing. But also recognize how cool is it that Abel had such faith in that he was willing to live for God when maybe the world was feeling against him. He felt like he wanted to just not live for God because he had never seen this God. That was how Cain acted. He was just doing the religious tradition, I'll just give my fruit offering or whatever to God. But no, what did Abel do? How did he live out his faith? Genesis says that he had given the firstborn of his sacrifice, the firstborn of his flock. What does firstborn mean? Firstborn was the very first and the very best sheep that he gave up from his flock, the very finest sheep, the very first sheep. Sheep weren't always guaranteed. There was sheep that, had more sheep, but if you only had like a couple sheep, you weren't guaranteed a whole flock. So to give God as a sacrifice the very first and very best, that showed that Abel knew that following God was worth it and that he had a plan to reconcile the world. So sheep weren't going to save him. God was. And so he was willing to give up his very first and very best thing for God. We have to see here that faith is not just doing religious things, but it is trusting in what is not seen and not here yet, but guaranteed. And the thing that reveals if we really do have that faith is acting upon that faith. If you see a bridge and you trust it, you're going to walk across it. That shows. Abel had faith that God was going to reconcile the world. And so as he's cultivating his sheep, he's saying, God, you're the provider of all things. This sheep, it's my livelihood. It's how I'm going to be fed. But God, you're better. I know you will provide. Take my very best. Take my very first. Here's the first thing that shows about Abel's faith. The faith of Abel tells us that a life of faith means giving our first and very best. A life of faith means that we give our very first and very best because God is our very first and he's our very best. And so the things that we hold so near and dear to our heart, we're willing to say, God, I trust in you. I trust in your promises. I trust that you are the very best. Take it. Take this relationship. Take this, the status that I'm searching for. Take my money. Take the things that I am holding on to so near and dear, and I trust you with it. And if you're really wondering what are the things that you're trying to hold near and dear, man, ask yourself, what are the things that if someone told you, if God came and said, hey, I want you to give this thing up, but you're going to say, absolutely not, I can't survive without that, that's probably more of an idol than it is a good gift from your Father. And so really weigh in that. What does it mean to have faith in God like Abel? It means that we are willing to give our very best and very first. And that creates a heart in us that is generosity. That creates generosity in us. I got to start trucking along. Living a life of faith means that we give our very first and best, and maybe a piece of that is how we spend our time, how we spend our time on a daily basis. And that actually leads us to the next person that's mentioned here. Hebrews 11:5-6 says that by faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. And he was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must first believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Okay, Enoch. Who the heck is Enoch? Like, we grow up probably hearing about Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah, all these different characters, even Noah, what we're going to talk about. But Enoch, who is Enoch and what is he about? How does his faith encourage us? Enoch is kind of the mystery man of the Hall of Faith because he's only mentioned in one other part in the entire Bible, and that's in Genesis 5, and it's only for 3 verses in a long genealogy. And it reads off like this. This is Genesis 5. Genesis 5:21 says, when Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God, and after he had fathered Methuselah 300 years and had... Why did I say that? And had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God had took him. So the age of these people is a sermon for a whole nother time. But that's all we get about this guy Enoch. And if you look at where that is, that's at the very beginning of the Bible. And if you look at where Hebrews is, it's at the very end of the Bible. So like what's going on here? Why are we looking at Enoch and he's not even mentioned anywhere else? Genesis and Hebrews both say that Enoch had pleased God, and so therefore God had taken him. Does that mean that he died? Does that mean that he was like abducted, like aliens took him? Or like, what does it mean that God took him? But there's a lot of different theories and ideas surrounding this mystery man of the Hall of Faith, but don't miss what the author is trying to say about him. Enoch got to be in the presence of God right away, which was all perfect peace, all perfect joy, all perfect love, everything that we always seek for. He got to be in the presence of that because he had pleased God. And what did he do to please God? In Genesis, it says that Enoch walked with God. In the Hebrew wording, the wording of that literally means that he had a personal, intimate relationship and life of constant devotion with God. Now, some people think that like he and God were physically walking together. It very well could mean that. Personally, I don't think that he was literally walking with God like Adam and Eve were in the garden, because Adam and Eve and all of their children were cast out of the garden. But what I think that he's trying to say is that this was a few hundred years before the flood, where there was no one who was seeking God all the days in the days of Noah. So in a pre-flood world where no one sought for God, this was the epitome of discouragement and despair for Enoch. And yet Enoch was not going to follow the crowd. He was not going to follow along with the day. His life had perpetually been devoted to seeking the heart and the face of God. He did this by trusting the very same promise that Abel did, that God was going to reconcile the world one day. And he's going to do that by through the promise of someone who came from Eve. So he's trusting in this good promise that God has. And because he trusted in that promise, he devoted every day of his life to seeking the face of God in all that he did. Whatever he did, he was devoting his life, his time, and it's described as walking with God. And I just think it's so cool that Jesus invites us to be abiding in him, which is to remain in him. I think it's the same thing where we're called to always be remaining and walking with Jesus. And because he walked with God, he had a life of devotion. He was freed from the discouragements and distractions of the world to be in perfect peace. And we all devote ourselves to something. The author of Hebrews took one look at Enoch's life, and he saw that it was devoted to pursuing the living God. And so if someone was going to write a chapter in the most published, most sold book in human history that for thousands of years, millions, billions of people would read and put their faith in, if you got to be featured in only 3 sentences, what would you want that person to say that you devoted your life to? This person utterly devoted their life to schoolwork. This person was utterly devoted to her sorority, his fraternity. He was wholeheartedly devoted to pleasing his boss. She was so devoted and wholeheartedly devoted to her boyfriend, or he was devoted to her girlfriend. That was what their life was all about. What would you want the author of Hebrews to say is true about your life. If that is the case for you, if I told you that you could have the faith like Enoch, who was devoted, driven with one passion to please the living God, Almighty Yahweh, how cool is that? And don't overcomplicate it. You don't have to become a pastor or a college director to do this. Enoch wasn't any of those things. I don't know what occupation he was, but we're all called to pursue God in whatever sphere of life we're in, whether we're a college student of TCU or TCC or working a job or a high school student or whatever we become, we're called to always be pursuing God and resting in him. And so, man, what would it look like for you to live and devote your time to God, not be devoted to the things that the world is clamoring for attention, being distracted by this world? But if you wanted the author of Hebrews to write 3 sentences, that's all you get in the Bible, what would you want to be remembered for, to being devoted to in all that you did? Having faith like Enoch means regarding intimacy and time devoted to God as best time spent. And when we have faith like his, we gain a worthy devotion, a devotion that is not based on our status, on even our kids being blessed, which is a good thing. But ultimately, if we have faith like Enoch's, we will gain a worthy devotion that is meant to seeking the face of God. And I don't know about you guys, but I want my best friends and my family to know that guy was crazy about Jesus. That guy was crazy about seeing the kingdom of God come, and in everything that he did, whether it was my finances or school, whatever it is, he wanted Jesus, and that's it. I want that to be the case for you guys too, and I'm pretty sure God does too. So devotion to God means having a proper view of God that is honoring him accordingly, which is exactly what our last example does right. Noah. So Hebrews 11, verse 7 through just 7. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. So what kind of faith did Noah have? We're familiar with the story, the rainbow, the boat, animals, all that fun stuff. So what kind of faith did Noah have here? Again, take a step back, forget everything you know, and put yourself in Noah's shoes. God told you that a giant flood, the likes of which the world has never seen before, will wipe out the earth except for you and your family. And now he tells you to build a massive boat, to put every kind of animal on that boat so that your family will live. You can't tell me that people didn't treat Noah like a tinfoil hat wearing preaching pastor that was telling everyone, get in the boat, it's going to end the world. That sounds insane. We can say that. If someone were to do that today, the movie Evan Almighty, we're supposed to laugh at that because anyone not know Evan Almighty? Yeah? Okay, a few of you. Look it up. It's funny. Not biblical, but it's fine. So it was crazy because it doesn't sound natural, but Noah had faith that God really did tell him this and that he was trusting in what was not seen, but guaranteed. He knew that God was going to do this. And even when the entire world was telling him, you're a fool, he said, no, I know my God, and I'm going to live by faith in that promise. In Hebrews, it says that Noah had reverent fear. He had reverent fear because the fear of God is something that I feel like a lot of us really don't fully understand, and it's hard to grasp. Basically, the fear of God means reverence or high regard. It's the difference between your buddy telling you to do something versus a police officer giving you instructions on the side of a highway. The difference is that that police officer has an authority and power that your best friend does not. Noah had faith and assurance that God really loved him and really cared for him despite his sin. But he also knew that God had a lot of power and the supreme amount of authority. And because he knew about the power and authority of God, he understood how much God hates sin. And the reason he hates sin is because now his entire world that he created to enjoy him and enjoy his love has rejected him and ran away from him. And that grieves God. And so he did something that was crazy. He chose to hit the reset button. And he said, this is what's going to happen. Noah, you're the only guy who's seeking me, so the rest of the world is going to be brought about by you. And he knew what was going to happen. But Noah was thinking, this is how God resets the world. But then, of course, we see how even after Noah himself falls into sin right after the flood. And it shows that sin is pervasive in all of us, regardless of what happens. Again, a sermon for another time. But we see how it basically, Noah had a reverence, an assurance in the authority and power of God, and that showed that he had fear of God over fear of man. When we care more about what God thinks for us rather than what people think, we are assured that the opinions of people are nothing in comparison to what God thinks about us. When people are confused about why we as Christians live differently and avoid sin at all costs, it's because we know that sin offends a holy God, and we want to be holy like him and not offend him. We want to love him because he gave everything for us, so we want to give everything for him. And because that's the entire point of why Jesus came to die, we don't want to add more to his pain. We don't want to add more onto the cross, and we live out of thankfulness because we're going to heaven not because of what we can do for God, but because of what he did for us. And if the Son of God had to die for my sins to be forgiven, that must show the power and authority and the holiness, the separateness from sin that God is. That's something to be taken seriously. And that's what Noah did. And so despite all of the distractions and the discouragement that he felt from his community, his friends who weren't his family, he chose, no, I'm going to choose what God says, not what man's opinion of me is. Having faith like Noah means a life that fears God over fearing man. And when we live like this, when we have faith like Noah's, we gain a purpose to life. We have a reason for living. And that reason is to kill sin, to not look like the world, to not look like what Adam and Eve did, but we choose to live differently from what man wants to do. But we live into what God's good design is. And we have a purpose to tell everyone, hop on the boat. Hop on the boat. There's a flood coming. We have to get on the boat. There is a holy and righteous judge that will condemn sin, but he's also so gracious to offer a boat, except we don't have a boat, we have a cross. We have a cross who the Son of God gladly got on and took your place and my place to say, no, I'll take their sin. I'll take their penalty that they deserve. And if they're willing to trust me, I'll pay their debt. And I'll give them my righteousness because Jesus was the only good person to ever live. He was the only one that deserved good things. We don't. And he took our place, and now we take his in front of God. And that's not a heretical thing to say. That's not a bad thing because if we trust in him, we recognize that he's all we have. And now we live out of thankfulness, not to get right with God, but because God made us right with him. And that's grace. So remember, none of these things, none of these kinds of faith change the fact that we live in a constant, discouraging, and distracting world. Our faith won't change our circumstances, and that's hard to hear. I wish I was giving a sermon that changed how we can change our circumstances, that can change the world, but that's not the case. We live in a broken world. But how we enter into these circumstances will change by the kind of faith that we have. It's a question that we were asking at the very beginning. What kind of faith do we have? It's an assurance in the things that are hoped for, a conviction in the things that are not seen. We don't see it physically. We don't have it yet, but it's there. I know it, and I'm confident in it, and I'm banking my life on it. I'm giving my very first and my very best. I'm giving my devotion to God, and I'm fearing him more than anything else. And so as we avoid the ditches of abandoning ship, going back to the comforts in the world that we used to live in, or becoming absent, avoiding church altogether, avoiding the community that we have here at Encounter and Doxology, as we avoid those things, if we stay on the road of faith, not the ditches, but we keep our faith eyes ahead of what is to come, we will have generous hearts like Abel. We will live generously and not withhold, but give generously. We will have devoted hearts like Enoch. And we will have a God-fearing purpose, a God-fearing heart like Noah, and we will endure and stand strong to the very end. And so I didn't write any reflection questions, but just for the next 2 minutes, I want you guys to just sit with what you've heard today. Ask yourself, man, what are the idols that I'm holding on to? What are the things that I would say that I can't live without? If God were to ask me to give that up, and my first inclination is absolutely not, I can't do it, then man, lay that at the feet of Jesus. So that's the first question I kind of want you to wrestle with. Second question is, what kind of faith do you need? Maybe it's all three of these guys, where it's a faith that is generous, like Abel, giving your very first and very best. Or it's a faith like Enoch that regards devotion and time with God as primary with how we spend our time. Or maybe it's a God-fearing heart, like Noah, where we recognize that God is holy, and so we kill sin, otherwise sin is going to be killing us. And so ask yourself, what is the kind of faith that I need to adopt? And then ask yourself, what's my next step? What are you going to do about it? Because again, we adopt faith, but that leads to action. That leads to us doing something, and that shows that we have faith. And so man, if you recognize that you need to have faith, what's your next step? And possibly that's a relationship with Jesus. If you've never had that, if you've never taken a step of faith, the only step of faith that truly, truly matters is if we trust that Jesus is the Son of God, that he died on a cross in my place, and he really rose from the dead, and now he offers a hand. If you feel like you have not taken that hand before, accept it in faith. And if you already have, man, really wrestle with these types of examples that the author of Hebrews gives. So rest with that for a few minutes, and then we'll get back into some more worship.